and welcome to All About the Uniform. Here we are going to take a dive into the uniforms that would have been worn by the infantry during the American Revolution. By no means is this meant to cover all the uniforms that were worn throughout the war, but instead is a look at the ideal uniforms that would have been used by the British Army, the Royal Provincial Army, and the Continental Army. To start out, when you think of the word uniform, what comes to mind? For military purposes, what is a uniform used for? What does it do? To start with, uniform is a Latin-based word that is comprised of uni, meaning one, and formis, meaning form. A uniform shows that the military is organized and acting under one command. It also provides a standard of dress that can reflect order and discipline, while simultaneously instilling respect and fear into others. A uniform shows that an individual belongs to a group. It also creates an identity for the individual as well as that group. Uniforms provide identification of rank in the hierarchical structure, and in some cases can provide protection, such as with bulletproof vest. Uniforms also often follow a tradition. During the American Revolution, the Patriots went up against one of the most well-established, powerful, and recognizable armies of the time, the British Army in their Redcoats. But this army had not always been so organized, well-trained, and definitely not as recognizable. Before 1645, the English had no standing army, and while some regiments wore red, there was no standard uniform, meaning that there were many different colors being used. It was not until the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651 that red became the standard color for the English Army. During this time, Parliament created the New Model Army in 1645, and it became the first English army to have a standardized uniform. This new army was outfitted in red jackets faced with different colors to distinguish the regiments. The color red was chosen not to hide blood, as many believe, but because it was a cheap color to get and an easy color to obtain in large quantities. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, red continued to be a popular color for regiments, but was not required. The color and design of the regimental uniform was chosen by the colonel. These were often wealthy, titled men who had received royal approval to raise a regiment. The man's wealth was important as the government did not cover the cost of the regiment. Instead, the colonel was expected to cover all cost of equipment, uniforms, and the soldiers' wages. Despite the government not paying for the army and the uniforms not being standardized, a regular army still stood and was still formed. Finally, in 1706 and 1707, the Act of the Union was passed by both the English and Scottish parliaments, forming the United Kingdom. When this happened, the two nations' armies were united into one. During this time, the British government begins to take financial responsibility for the army, including paying for the clothing of privates. A uniform pattern was agreed on and included the use of the colored lining to distinguish the regiments. It is during this time that most regiments start being known by the numerical title as opposed to the colonel's name as had been previously used. While the king is back on the throne and controls the Royal Marines, Navy, and Air Force once it's formed in World War II, it is the Parliament who the British Army answers to. In 1751, a royal clothing warrant was passed. This set the regulations for the flags, clothing, and equipment to be used by the regiments of foot and cavalry, with a few exceptions. Soldiers were to wear red coats faced with their regimental colors, as had previously been done. It also set the standards for hats and caps. Grenadiers' caps were to be the same color as the facing of the regiment, with the king's cipher and crown embroidered on it. The little flap on the front was to be red with a white horse and the motto Nec aspera tarant stitched above it. The back of the cap was red with the turnip to be the color of the front and the number of the regiment stitched in the center. You can see here a hat from the 49th Regiment of Foot around 1751, following those directions. Grenadier caps are a perfect example of how tradition set the standard of the design of the uniform. In the 17th century, grenadiers were the strongest, largest, and most intimidating men in their regiment, as they were the ones that threw hand grenades. Their cap was designed so that it would not get in the way while throwing these grenades. But by the 18th century, most grenadiers were no longer throwing grenades. However, they continued to be the most physically fit and powerful of their units, and they were often used to lead assaults and were placed at the ends of rows during parades, as these would be the most prominent. Even though they were no longer throwing grenades, their caps remained the same shape. This warrant also stated that drummers were to have a coat that was the reverse of their regiment's coats. So, for example, if a regiment had green facing, the drummer's coat would be green with red facing. Sergeant's uniform was to be the same as their men, but with the addition of a worsted sash around their waist. Officers' uniforms were the same colors as their men's, but with silver lace or embroidery at the binding and buttonholes. They were to be distinguished by wearing a crimson silk sash over their left shoulder, and their sword knots were to be crimson with gold stripes. In 1768, a much more detailed royal clothing warrant was passed. This warrant stated that all regiments were to have their buttons stamped with their number. Corporal and private's coats were to be dyed using madder, which was a root that yielded an orange-red color. Of course, the facing was to remain the regiment's colors. Corporals were to be identified with silk epaulet on their right shoulders. Sergeants and higher-ranking officers' coats were to be dyed using cochineal, leaving them with a scarlet color. This dye was much more expensive as it had to be imported from South America, and was made from tiny bugs. Sergeants were also to have white braided buttonholes. Grenadiers had wings added to their uniforms with 6 loops of lace. Once again, musicians were to wear the reverse of their regiment unless the regimental color was red. In that case, they were to wear white with red facing. Officers could wear either gold or silver laced buttonholes. The battalion officers were to wear embroidered or laced epaulets on their right shoulder with gold or silver fringe, whichever matched the buttonholes, while grenadiers wore the same epaulet, but one on each shoulder. In this picture, you can see some men of several different ranks. Note the fifer and drum with the yellow coats faced in red. On one man, we can see a grenadier wing. Others have officers' epaulets. Note that all the men have gaiters covering their lower legs. The warrant continued on to dictate the colors of the waistcoats, which were to be either buff or white with matching belts. All soldiers were to have black gaiters, and the headgear was as followed. Corporals and privates were to have white tape binding, black cockades. Sergeants were to be laced with silver, as well as having black cockades. Officers were to be laced with gold or silver and black cockades. Grenadiers were to have black bearskin hats with the front of the King's cipher and motto, and the back with the regiment's number inside of a grenade. Fusiliers officers were similar to the grenadiers, but much shorter. And then musicians were also to have the black bearskin hats or caps with the front having the King's cipher and trophies of colors and drums, and the back having the number of their regiment. In this picture, you can get a good look at the hat of the musicians, both the front and the back. Sashes were used to distinguish officers. Sergeants wore crimson worsted sashes with a strip of the facing color. If the facing was red, then the strip was to be white, and the sash was to be worn around the waist. Officers had crimson silk sashes worn around their waist, and swords were to be the same color as the buttons. These swords were carried by officers, sergeants, grenadiers, and musicians. An officer's gorget was to match the color of the regiment's medal or their buttons and swords. So now that we know what the uniform would have looked like, let's take a look at how the British Army in the colonies would have been formed. The presence of the British Army in America and other colonies and territories was a major factor in the expansion of the English Empire. During times of war, they would often raise provincial regiments, men from those colonies, to help out and assist the regular army. This happened during the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, which of course involved a large portion of the great powers of Europe, England being one of them. During this time, England did raise provincial troops in North America to help supplement the regular army. Some of the tasks that these provincial troops would have been tasked with would be garrison the colonies, capture strategically important territories, assisting with protection of colonial borders, providing support for their allied governments, and helping suppress the rivals that may protest against the British government. After the French and Indian War, the provincial regiments are disbanded and released from service, so that by the time of the American Revolution, the numbers of soldiers in America is at a peacetime low. But as war is once again breaking out, the British Army needs extra support, and they will begin to eventually raise provincials once more. So how were the Royal Provincials different from the regular army or even the militia during the Revolutionary War? To start with, the provincial army was not a militia, but was roughly the equivalent of the Continental Army. They were full-time military organization that served throughout the Revolution for the duration of the war. While they only served in North America, unlike the militia, they could be sent throughout the entire area of the colonies. The men's pay, food, clothing, and ammunition and arms were provided by England. However, they came from a separate store or supply store than the British Army. The military discipline in the provincials was there, although it was maybe not quite as strict as in the British Army. The soldiers of the provincial army were all volunteers. The provincials were raised, drafted, and disbanded under the authority of the commander-in-chief in America. The uniforms were based off the British Army, but the coats were not always red. In fact, many colors were used, including green and blue. While the British Army's buttons were marked with their regiment's number, the provincial buttons were marked with RP for Royal Provincial. As you can see, we have a Royal Provincial button right here. During the Revolution, the British were slow to begin raising the provincial forces, and most of the regiments were not formed until 1777 or later. Royal Provincials were viewed kind of as a secondary class in the military. However, they could obtain a higher rank, which was known as the American Establishment. In order to hit the American Establishment rank, this could be done by achieving a quota of men and performing valuable services during the war. If this status was met, officers became entitled to half pay and permanent rank. There were 5 regiments throughout the Revolutionary War that earned this rank, and they became the 1st through the 5th American regiments. These regiments were the Queen's American Rangers, the Volunteers of Ireland, the New York Volunteers, the King's American Regiment, and the British Legion. Once they hit the higher status of the American Establishment, they were allowed to order their clothing from England, and their buttons changed from being marked with the RP to being marked with their number. Okay, so the British and even the Royal Provincial Army have pretty standard uniforms during the American Revolution. But what about the other side? What about the Continental Army? When the war first starts, of course, there's no Continental Army, really only militia, and since they're militia, they don't have any uniforms. As the war progresses, each state will pass laws to establish a colonial militia, with the exception of Pennsylvania. The Continental Army is going to evolve from these militias, and on June 14, 1775, the Continental Congress will officially establish the Continental Army. Enlistments are to last only a year, and clothing is supposed to be supplied by the states. Since clothing is being provided by the different states, there's not a standard uniform, and it varies greatly. The next day, on June 15th, Washington is appointed Commander-in-Chief of this brand new army. On July 18, 1775, the Continental Congress suggests that each man should come to join the army with the following. They should have a firelock, a bayonet, a sword or tomahawk, a cartridge box with 24 rounds, or a powder horn with 2 pounds of powder and 2 pounds of lead, and a knapsack. Eventually, the clothing recommendations are to be paid for by the Congress, but at this point, many states have already started working towards clothing their own men. Congress does order these supplies of caps, breeches, waistcoats, shoes, and fabric for making more clothing, but there's not enough and there's a general shortage. On July 1775, Washington's general orders began providing uniform identification for the officers. Before this, there had been no standard identification. Washington's general orders of July 1775 stated that the commander-in-chief was to wear a light blue ribbon across his breast between his coat and his waistcoat. Here we have an image of Washington, and he does have that blue sash or ribbon across his chest, and it is also placed between his coat and waistcoat, or his vest as we would usually call them today. Major generals are to wear a purple ribbon, brigadier generals a pink ribbon, aides de camp green ribbons, field officers are to wear a red or pink cockade in their hat, captains a yellow or buff-colored cockade, subalterns or junior officers green cockades, sergeants are to wear epaulets on their right shoulders or a strip of red sewn across their right shoulder. Colonels should wear epaulets of green. Washington also realizes that not everybody is going to have a uniform, and so he suggests that hunting shirts and long breeches should be used for the official uniform, and he does push for that. However, the reason it's not chosen is that there is a shortage of toe cloth, which is what was used to make these hunting shirts. Most coats that are out there and are being used for uniforms are different colors. Most of the colors are blue, brown, and green, and they, like the British, do base the facing off of regiment's colors. By 1776, many regiments are still without a uniform, and those uniforms that are available are still varied in both design and color, so not a whole lot has changed. The domestic clothing supplies and fabric supplies are dwindling even more, and so the Continental Congress begins to import fabric from other places. They will also take confiscated or captured redcoats and alter them, oftentimes re-dyeing them. This usually resulted in a brownish kind of color. In June of 1776, Congress suggests that the states should provide men with the following items: buckskin waistcoat, breeches, blanket, hat or a cap, 2 pairs of hose, 2 shirts, and 2 pairs of shoes. Also, in December of 1776, the enlistment period increases from 1 year to 3 years. So they're starting to realize this is going to be a much longer war than anybody had anticipated. As the war progresses, the states and Congress still do not have an agreed on clothing and uniform that is to be provided to the soldiers. But regardless, clothing continues to be in short supply. As France enters the war and assists the newly formed nation, they will start importing supplies and uniforms from France as well. And there's, of course, still no army-wide uniform or pattern. There is, at one point, a shipment of brown and blue coats that are received. The blue coats are the preferred choice, and so to make things kind of fair, there's a lottery held, and each state draws, and the states, some end up with blue and some end up with brown. Now there are some blue coats left over. With those, they'll do another lottery, this one by the regiments. So this results in the confusion that there's some states that have all blue coats, some states that have all brown coats, and some states that have a mix. In 1777, Washington accepts a pattern that is recommended by the Marquis de Lafayette for a uniform. It is based on French fashion, so the coat has a large lapel and high collar and large 3-inch cuffs. Like the British Army, the facing color is to identify the regiments. It's also suggested to him that the hat should be a round hat with a 3-inch brim turned up on one side and adorned with small feather. Under the jackets or the coats, the waistcoat should have no pockets or belt, and overalls or breeches and stockings should be worn. If there are no stockings, then half gaiters. Even though Washington accepts this, it's still not been approved by the Congress, and he doesn't have the authority yet to completely decide on the uniform. Finally, in 1779, Washington is given the authority by the Congress to set a uniform standard. This is to include the color of the coat as well as the facings for the coats. At this point, the Continental uniform does become standardized, or at least the ideal uniform becomes standardized. The coats are to be blue, and then the facings colors will be divided by the states. White facing will be used for New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Buff facing for New York and New Jersey. Scarlet or red facing for Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. And blue facing for North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. As I mentioned, this is just the ideal situation. There's still not enough to go around, so there's still a lot of variation throughout the Army in the uniforms. In 1782, Washington issues general orders that will create a distinction for those who served a certain length of time in the war. He will also create the Purple Heart, which of course we still have today. Now, also fighting during the war, of course, is the militia. Both loyalists and patriots have militia fighting for them. And these are men who were raised to supplement the army within a very small area, basically the area that they lived. Because they are not part of the regular army, they do not usually receive clothing allowances. Instead, they just wear their normal everyday clothes. They also do not usually receive supplies, so they bring their own weapons and provisions. While they typically serve only within the area that they live, there were instances where they did cross borders. You might think of the Over Mountain Men at Kings Mountain. They definitely crossed some borders. Unlike the British Provincial and Continental armies, they also only served a very short period of time, usually through the expedition. So now that we've talked about how the uniforms varied from the British to the Provincials to the Continentals, let's take an overview at the different parts of the uniforms. So of course, basics, you've got your shirt, waistcoat, a coat or jacket, breeches, trousers or overalls, stockings, shoes or boots, gaiters, garters to keep your stockings up, hats or caps, and neck stocks. These would have been your basic uniform. Equipment that you would need and would be part of your uniform would be your haversack, canteen, your cartridge box, a bayonet and bayonet belt, and a sword or a tomahawk. Symbols of rank that would have been in addition to the uniform if you were an officer would include possibly sashes, gorgets. If you don't know what a gorget is, the top picture here, this kind of crescent looking gold object, that is a gorget. Epaulettes, which we have pictured underneath the gorget, and then of course cockades. So these are kind of just an idea of what the uniforms would have looked like. Like I said, this is by no means covering all the uniforms that were out there, but just an idea of what the ideal would have been. I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope you've learned something. Thank you for joining us and have a nice day.